All right, good evening, everyone. Tonight's speaker event is being recorded. My name is Emily Spence, and I am the Director of Education at Old North Illuminated. Welcome, and thank you for attending and supporting tonight's talk. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to our friends at Hubtown Tours for their continued support of the Old North Digital Speaker Series. At Old North, we are committed to sharing the stories of all the people and communities that are part of our site's physical, spiritual, and social history. The Old North Church sits on the ancestral land of the Massachusetts people. By the time Old North was built in 1723, the Massachusetts people had been driven and displaced from their homes, but they did not disappear, and nor should their stories and memories. We have a great lineup of speaker series events coming this fall. On September 17th, we will be hosting a book chat with Loyalist historian Patrick O'Brien to discuss the novel Johnny Tremain. Other topics this fall include music in Revolutionary America and also another book chat. So stay tuned for more information about our fall lineup. And as always, if you find yourself in the North End this summer, we hope you will visit Old North. Our crypt may be figuratively and literally the coolest place in Boston right now. This evening, I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Alexandria Russell, the author of the recently published book, Black Women Legacies. Since the late 1800s, African American women have organized to create memorials commemorating Black women across time. Perhaps one of the most impressive examples of this is the commemoration of Phillis Wheatley. More than a century after her death, Wheatley's legacy was kept alive by Black women living across the United States, from Massachusetts to New Mexico. In her talk tonight, Dr. Russell will showcase how Phillis Wheatley became the most memorialized Black woman of the Jim Crow era through the remarkable efforts of Black women who operated with resourcefulness and savvy to create public memorials that shaped American culture. Dr. Alexandria Russell is the executive director of the Boston Women's Heritage Trail and the non-resident W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute Fellow at Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. She is the founder of Black Women Legacies, a nonprofit organization that supports digitally mapping historic and contemporary memorials of Black women across the globe on a free website. She earned her bachelor's in political science and secondary education from the College of Charleston and her PhD in history from the University of South Carolina. She has also worked on Capitol Hill, was a middle school educator in South Carolina, and was a public history consultant with the National Park Service and Historic Columbia. In 2023, she is a 2023 recipient of the South Carolina Preservation Service Award for her contributions to African American women's history research and documentation. As a historian, memorializer, and public history practitioner, Dr. Alexandria Russell is committed to ethical research practices that recover obscure histories and create accessible pathways for bringing diverse histories to people of all backgrounds. What a pleasure it is to have her with us this evening. And now I will remind you to please mute your microphones and put any questions you have in the chat. There will be some time at the end for Alexandria to answer these questions. And now I will turn it over to you, Alexandria.
Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here today and just really excited to be able to talk about Phillis Wheatley. I just want to publicly thank you, Emily, for helping coordinate and inviting me. Emily and Catherine Matthews at Old North gave me a fantastic tour, and she is right. The tomb is really cool. It is amazing, and I would highly recommend you visiting that. I was really moved by their new children's exhibition. So I just wanted to let everyone here know about the amazing children's exhibition that they have. Oftentimes as educators and, I write curriculums for museum exhibitions and work with educators and all the time, but rarely, and I can't recall ever having seen an exhibition from the perspective of children. So if you are a 9-year-old, you're a 9-year-old boy or girl going to Old North, you are learning the history through someone who was your age during that time period. And I just think that that is a brilliant idea and a really accessible way to teach the history to children. So I just wanted to take a couple seconds to shout that out. I also want to thank the supporters from the Boston Women's Heritage Trail and some of our community partners, including Ann Morowitz, who works on the North End Black History Tour. Thank you for helping to promote the event and for being here tonight. And thank you all for coming here today. So let's see here. I want to, just give kind of an overview about our discussion, and I do want to make it conversational. I'm happy to, go more at length about any of the subjects here. But one of the things that I mentioned to Emily that I was really excited about was that I get to kind of talk about the whole scope of Phillis Wheatley's memorialization. And typically, I just kind of talk about a chunk here or there because of time constraints or the program. So I'm really excited about, letting you know what was my journey to the Wheatley brand that I have kind of named it. And also, how does the Wheatley brand fit into the context of my book, Black Women Legacies, and what is the overall context of African American women's memorialization? So I'll give kind of a overview of all of that. And then I want to talk about the meat of the Wheatley brand, so to speak, the name memorials that comprise the Wheatley brand. Organizations, enterprises named for Phillis Wheatley from the 1890s until the 1960s, until her brand starts to take a shift. And then I'll talk about what does that shift look like in the mid 20th century, and what is our current era of commemoration, which I like to call the Phillis Wheatley Peters era. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And again, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. I want this to be as much of a conversation as possible. I am going to read a couple of excerpts from chapter 1, which is the Wheatley brand, the Phillis Wheatley brand in Black Women Legacies. But as I mentioned, I want to have a discussion with you today. So please bring your questions and comments to the end of the presentation. So, what was my journey? It's really fun to reflect on my journey to the Wheatley brand, particularly because I started out um, with the idea that this would be literally an epilogue, a few pages at the end of my dissertation. And when I was finished with it, it became the largest chapter in my dissertation and book because her legacy is so extensive. And when I started to write and research her legacy, my entry point was YWCAs. I had, been studying Black women's history for several years at that point, and, having grown up in the South, you see Phillis Wheatley YWCAs. And I had this question, why are there so many of these young women's Christian associations named for Phillis Wheatley? And that question took me on a roller coaster of a ride, which I'll get more into. But that was kind of how I came to the Wheatley brand. And what I discovered was that the expansiveness of her memorialization was kind of so embedded into the fabric of every region of the country that this was more than just a name memorial. This became a brand. And really conceptualizing the Phillis Wheatley brand, I was able to think about memorial brands. So Phillis Wheatley has a particular symbolism to her. And I will talk about that a little bit more when I discuss her public memory. But in addition to kind of the Wheatley brand, what I discovered is that all memorials have a brand. They have a symbolism. They're not all employed in the same way. And hers certainly is the most extensive employment during the Jim Crow era. But this particular chapter, this conceptualization really led to a lot of other things. I'll also talk about the culture of recognition because the African American women who memorialized Wheatley were not just celebrating her, they were also celebrating themselves. And so that duality of acknowledgement and celebration is something that I derived from writing this chapter as well. So it is fun. It is extensive in that I get to go to Albuquerque, New Mexico via the documents. But it's also really edifying in knowing that there was this type of commemoration happening during a time that hasn't really been acknowledged in terms of Black public history. So that's kind of how I came to the Wheatley brand and then how that dominoed into a lot of other things. This is the first chapter, as I mentioned, in Black Women Legacies, and it's part of the first part of the book that is dealing with Jim Crow and named memorials. Typically, when we think of public history, we think of statues and memorials, maybe gravesite memorials. Maybe we think of monuments or house museums. But name memorials were the primary medium of commemoration during the Jim Crow era for a variety of reasons. But one was that it didn't cost you anything to name something for someone. You can come up with the Phillis Wheatley Club without any cost. And, you know, the subsequent settlement houses and YWCA certainly had money associated with them, but to name something for someone did not cost you a thing. And that's what made it so popular. And so part one talks about not only Phillis Wheatley, but Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, and how we think about name memorials disseminating Black history. I talk about living memorials. Some of the women who had clubs named for them actually got to interact with their namesake. So Mary Church Terrell, who I'll talk a little bit about, Mary McLeod Bethune, they would correspond with the Mary McLeod Bethune clubs across the country and on occasion visit with them. And so that was a different type of living name memorial that I write about. And then I talk about how name memorials are used to mark public space. So in segregated neighborhoods, naming a Booker T. Washington High School, which you probably all have heard of, I certainly have, being from South Carolina, you know, it's a way to denote immediately that this is an African American school. And that was done with community centers, that was done with libraries, that was done with a myriad of public spaces. And so that is part one. It's called Creating Their Own World. The second part talks about the transition from name memorials to what we typically think of, statues and house museums, and the traditional public history mediums that I call them. And those were memorials that came about as a result of extended access or expanded access to not just public space, but to legislatures, to the national legislature, being enfranchised and having the right to vote, having a say in Congress, becoming a mayor of a town, really it dictated who gets to decide how public space is used and how public funding is used. And so you see this kind of flourishing, I call it the golden era of traditional public history memorials, the Bethune statue in DC, the Mary Ellen Pleasant marker in San Francisco, the smallest park in San Francisco. It consists of 5 or 6 eucalyptus trees on a block, as well as a marker. I talk about house museums, a couple in my hometown of Columbia, South Carolina, the Majeska Simpkins House and the Celia Mann Simon site. Those are kind of the traditional memorials that take place in the latter half of the 20th century. And so I talk about that on the national, the state, and the local arenas and what that looks like. And then the conclusion kind of ends with our current terrain today. And so in many ways, our discussion about Phillis Wheatley is going to model that trajectory. But that's basically the scope of Black Women Legacies. And I'd be happy to talk about any other topic that people are interested in the Q&A. So the Phillis Wheatley brand, getting to the meat of why we're here today. Um, so the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs was the largest African American organization in the early 20th century. It was comprised of women's clubs from all over the country. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who many of us are familiar with in Boston, was a key influence in the club coming together. Her and her daughter, Florida, I've heard it pronounced a couple different ways. They authored The Woman's Era, and it really was a magazine or periodical that spoke to the era. This was about Black club women coming together to make serious interventions in the lives of African Americans, from educational facilities, daycares, senior citizens or assisted living spaces, settlement houses for people migrating to different parts of the country. They took up a lot of the social welfare causes that sustained, some would say saved the African American community in a time where access to public funding and social welfare services from the state was limited or non-existent. And so they did this. In doing this, they created this national infrastructure of name memorials. And they named um, many of their clubs, not all, as we'll see in a second, but many of their clubs they named for Black women, some of whom were living and some of whom were also already deceased. But in naming them, they developed the primary mode of commemoration for the Jim Crow era, and that was the named memorials. And as I mentioned, they have a dual purpose. They're partially disseminating history or information about a particular person, but it's also an acknowledgement and a recognition of the good work and the service that people are doing. Many of us have heard lifting as we climb as the NACW's motto. And I would add, as you know, they're doing this uplift work, upbuilding work. They're also participating in the culture of recognition. And we will see how that manifests. So let's start with what I'm sure many people are interested in. You know, why would there be a Phillis Wheatley Club in Albuquerque, New Mexico? This is coming from the first convening, the first national convening of the National Association of Colored Women's Treasurers Report. And this particular list is in the history, and you can see, and I'm not sure how big your screen is, you might not be able to see everything, but you can see there are quite a few clubs here, and they're all not named for women. Now, I do have a question about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was another poet who was highly memorialized at this time as well. I haven't delved deeply into her memorialization, but there's something that's going on about poetry and these women's clubs in this era. And it's a question that I've had. But as you can see, just from this first report, there are quite a few Phillis Wheatley clubs that are on the map. New Orleans was kind of the catalyst to start a lot of this. And it's interesting because when I talk to friends and colleagues who live or are from New Orleans, it's not necessarily a place that you would think about Black women's memorialization, or because of some of the contentious contemporary debates that they've had around public history. But it was the catalyst for the Phillis Wheatley brand in 1895. And then you have Nashville and Chicago, Greenville, Mississippi to follow. And by the time we have this treasurer's report, as you can see, there's a club in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I use this example to show the expansive nature of her memorialization. It meant something to these women, and it didn't just fall out of the sky. At this time, I don't know if it was a brand, but over the next few decades, it certainly becomes one. And the work that these women are doing in Phillis Wheatley's name is the foundation of her commemoration. Now, I'm sure you probably are wondering, well, why Phillis Wheatley? Why are they memorializing her so much? I'm going to get to that in a little bit because it has so much resonance for our discussion right now when we're talking about America 250. So I'll put a pin in that for the moment. So in addition to the Phillis Wheatley clubs, we have settlement houses. And the settlement houses were quite expansive as well. They were typically for women and girls, as you can see in the ad from the Phillis Wheatley Association in Cleveland, Ohio. And they were places not just for the women themselves to live, but they were community centers. Some of these settlement homes were political salons. They were places to hang out. In Boston, I learned just this Saturday at a wonderful unmonument program that the Harriet Tubman House was not just a settlement home, but it was a place for African Americans in the South End to convene for, whether it's playing with family or friends, or whether it's for a program. They function quite similarly. And so that's what this Phillis Wheatley Association was. Now, I will also point out that this comes from the crisis, and I'll talk a little bit more about W.E.B. Du Bois's role in Phillis Wheatley's memorialization, but because I'm in the Berkshires and because we are unveiling a statue of Du Bois on Saturday, I just wanted to mention that he was an avid memorializer and promoter of Phillis Wheatley's public memory during the Jim Crow era. It's part of what makes it a brand that becomes a commercial enterprise in a couple of instances. And so the Phillis Wheatley Association ad in the crisis is part of his robust support for these organizations. The other picture is one of my favorites. I love the little headbands with the PW on there. These were the Phillis Wheatley Diamonds of Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota, at the Minnesota Phillis Wheatley home. And they had a series of sports teams that they played against. But I just love this picture because it shows part of the work that African American women were doing at these settlement homes was caring for children and providing safe spaces for them to thrive and be a child in a very contentious and violent era for African Americans. And so this is, a softball team. Or baseball team, as it says on the picture. I imagine it was softball, but it says it was baseball. And this was just a space, that's part of the reason why I called this section of the book Creating Their Own World, because they were really creating these opportunities for children, but also teaching them. When you say that you're a part of the Phillis Wheatley baseball team or the Phillis Wheatley Diamonds, there's something that is going on in terms of understanding who she was and what she means to you today. And so it was a really effective tool of disseminating history to young people while giving them a safe space for just a little bit of fun. So these types of settlement homes existed all over the country. But then there were also other commemorations of Phillis Wheatley. The Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was founded by Marcus Garvey in Jamaica and then brought to the United States in the late 19 teens, they had a Black Star Line that was, envisioned to be a very commercial enterprise that would support Black economic freedom and that would support transporting African Americans with dignity and during a time where transportation was segregated and indignities were quite frequent for Black travelers. And so the Black Star Line had the SS Frederick Douglass, the SS Booker Washington, and the SS Phillis Wheatley. Now, the Phillis Wheatley line would take Black people from New York to the coast of West Africa. And I think that that was particularly poignant and symbolic that an African American or a Black woman would be the purveyor of freedom via a ship. Many of us know that Phillis Wheatley was kidnapped on the coast of West Africa and brought to the cold shores of New England on a ship called the Phyllis. And so this kind of reclamation of Phyllis on a ship, instead of leading Black people to enslavement, it's leading them to freedom, to economic empowerment. It is, it's particularly poignant. And I love the story. Now, the SS Phillis Wheatley never came into fruition. It's part of the reason why Marcus Garvey ended up in jail. And there's a whole nother history about that. But the utility of what that symbolism meant says a lot about what people were doing during that time and what Phillis Wheatley meant to a lot of people. While the steamship never came into fruition, they still memorialized Phillis Wheatley in a different way, and that was with the Phillis Wheatley Hotel in New York. And you can see in Booker Washington University. So there's a different type of named memorial because, again, it may cost a lot to get a steamship going, but it doesn't really cost anything to name something. And so many of the members, I believe over half, were Black women. And so it makes a lot of sense why Phillis Wheatley would have been a prominent name memorial that the UNIA employed during this time. And then we have the Phillis Wheatley Publishing Company out of New York as well. And, again, I mentioned Du Bois. These come from his papers at the Du Bois Center at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And I had a lot of fun learning about the Phillis Wheatley Publishing Company. Similar to the UNIA trying to purvey that symbolism in terms of leading Black people to freedom via a ship, the publishing company wanted to do that through educational books, secondary educational books. And they went through a couple of different iterations. Du Bois served on the editorial committee for the publishing company and for what they wanted to launch as both a who's who in colored America, but also a secondary reader for grade school children in kind of middle grades. I think it would be like 5th through 8th grade. So a little bit of elementary, but mostly, middle grades. And so the company was named in her honor in order to really celebrate the fact that she, in the words of the Norton Anthology of African American Literature, started the Black literary tradition in the US. And so this was a fitting memorial, but also there was cachet behind Phillis Wheatley's name during this era. And so they worked in concert with one another. And then my favorite is Phillis Wheatley bread. I love telling people that there is Phillis Wheatley bread. It was a very short-lived product, but it was one that I've seen several different ads for, mostly in the Detroit Tribune, but it was in other publications I've seen in Detroit as well, and just throughout the area. It was considered to be an all-race product. It was considered to be a product that not only nourish the body, the physical body, but nourish the soul, so to speak, because you were eating something that really gave you a sense of pride. And Lily Brooks, as you can see in the ad, is Joe Lewis's mother. She was the official spokesperson for this bread, and it came in 6 different varieties. So it was a very popular, it was popular, I think, in Detroit, but it was short-lived. But it shows you how her name, how her brand was used, not only with African American women's clubs, but in other enterprises as well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, my entry point to the Phillis Wheatley named saga is the YWCAs. I mean, when I was growing up, I always read about Phillis Wheatley YWCAs. And my question was, why are all these clubs named for Phillis Wheatley? And as you can see, that question led me, to learn so much more. But these were really important organizations as well, because many of them formed from organizations that already existed. But the YWCA had a kind of a centralized resource bank. And African American club women were very savvy, and they determined that if they would link with the YWCA, that they would have expanded resources for their organizations and the service work that they were doing. Many of these club women, if not all of them, were Christians, and their faith was kind of the foundation of why they did the service work that they did. They did have lots of social gatherings and those types of things, but at the heart of any club, whether it was a literary club or a bridge club, they all had service at the heart, and they did that in many cases because of their faith. And so aligning with the Young Women's Christian Association was a perfect fit that aligned with their faith and also gave them additional resources to serve communities. And so typically they were branches of white YWCAs. And so to delineate between the white Y and the black Y, so to speak, a lot of them were named for Phillis Wheatley. I also use the YWCAs to really showcase how the changing tide, and I'll talk about the shift in just a moment, but how the shift began to happen. Once African Americans got additional resources, once there was an opportunity for historians to write more about Black women's history, there was a larger terrain of women who could be memorialized and how we disseminated that information to our communities. And so a mixture of segregation, additional women to be memorialized, and opportunities to develop statues and markers and museums, it shifted the way that the Wheatley name was used. And so one example that I use in Black Women Legacies is the Asheville YWCA. What once was a Phillis Wheatley branch, when the white Y and the black Y came together, they just were called the Central Branch. And that's typically what happened. When spaces became integrated or desegregated, the name also left as well, because again, they were markers of public space and delineators of cultural identity. And so that's what happened quite often. But as my Aunt Pam reminded me, who was living in Knoxville, Tennessee at the time, there's still Phillis Wheatley YWCAs, and there is still one in Knoxville, Tennessee. So I want to just briefly talk about, America 250 and how Phillis Wheatley's legacy was used in terms of thinking about the founding of our nation. Now, some of us are familiar with her poetry and her writings, her famous meeting of George Washington and writing about what many would consider revolutionary heroes. But for African American women, a century later, and looking at a bicentennial celebration, This was an opportunity to really think about what role did Black women play in the founding of our country. And Mary Church Terrell does that. And I'm just going to read a very brief excerpt to give some more context for why she did that. Like other Black like other African American club women, Mary Church Terrell wielded Wheatley's public memory to refute negative public discourse. Her 1932 historical pageant play, based on the life of Phillis Wheatley, centered the poet as an integral part of the founding of the nation. As a member of the Committee on Coordinating Activities among Colored People for the George Washington Bicentennial Celebration in the District of Columbia in 1932, Terrell found in the plays and pageants compiled that, quote, without exception, the colored people mentioned in them were objects of ridicule. She decided to write her own pageant and chose Wheatley as the central focus, deeming the poet a credible representative and lifting up the writer as one whose career our young people would have reason to be proud. Wheatley's life story was acted out in a series of dance and dialogue scenes that emphasized her African heritage and famed communication with George Washington. Terrell, a deaf public memory crafter and memorialized Black woman herself, understood the significance of promoting the public legacies of African American women. Her emphasis on Wheatley's African heritage demonstrated the diasporic lineage of African Americans. She believed Wheatley's life story would increase the colored youth's respect for his African ancestors by showing the native ability and the brilliant literary success of an African girl stolen from her native land. By noting that Wheatley was stolen, Terrell underscored the realities of slavery's terrorism and dehumanization of Black bodies. She employed Wheatley's public memory to display both the tragedy and the triumph of enslaved Black women. So you get a sense of, you know, this is not just a play. This is not just another extension of her brand, but the symbolism behind it is really powerful in terms of learning and teaching about how we were, as a people, very involved in the founding of our nation, and how slavery was very much intertwined with that founding. And so this is in 1932. As we think about America 250, as we think about revolutionaries' histories and how they have evolved over time, there's a real intentional effort to make sure that multiple voices, a myriad of voices and histories are included in the founding of our country. And this gives us another way to think about how we might do that, how we might engage with that history almost 100 years after she wrote this play. So in terms of the shift of Phillis Wheatley's brand, for our literary scholars, there has been a lot of debate about Phillis Wheatley's poetry and if it was, revolutionary enough. Typically, that is a sentiment echoed during the Black arts movement in the mid-20th century. I offer a different perspective of that because we have an opportunity for African American women, some of the most notable poets, American poets, and African American women poets of all time were at this convening. I'm talking about Alice Walker and Nikki Giovanni and Audre Lorde. And it's a real opportunity to think about the changing tide or the shift of Phillis Wheatley's public memory. This happened in November of 1973, although the article comes out a few months later. And Margaret Walker, who, for those of us in academia and those of us contending with federal grants, she was one of the first African American women to really get an NEH grant to do a conference centered around Phillis Wheatley. At the time, it was a celebration of the 200th anniversary of Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, which Wheatley published and made her the first Black person in the US to have a published book. And, as I mentioned early, kind of started the Black literary tradition. And so it was a celebration about that. But again, culture of recognition, it was a celebration of themselves. Alice Walker, reads the first version of Our Mother's Garden, that many of us are familiar with. And there were just a series of artwork and performances and music and poetry that really commemorated a new era of thinking about Phillis Wheatley. Now that academia, predominantly white institutions, were having more literary scholars and historians, there was a new terrain. And of course, dealing with the publishing industry, whether academic or outside of academia, was just a difficult terrain. And so women embraced Phillis Wheatley's legacy. They saw, like the women of the 1890s and the early 1900s, that there is a dissonance in American democracy. There is a dissonance in liberty and justice for all that doesn't always apply to Black women. And so Phillis Wheatley's kind of story of triumph, but also her words and also her journey was an inspiration to these women. And it's a different way of commemorating her while spaces are being integrated. A new generation of club women are more apt to join sororities as part of the Divine Nine, like, Delta Sigma Theta or Sigma Gamma Rho, which I'm a part of. And so the named clubs and the National Association of Colored Women, begins to wane in its influence, although it still exists today, and it still does make an impact in our communities, but certainly not at the level that it did in the early 1900s. And so the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival celebrated its 50th year anniversary a couple years ago, November 2023. And again, it was an opportunity to not just celebrate Phillis Wheatley, but to celebrate the achievements of African American literary scholars, writers, poets, historians, etc. And so that leaves us to kind of the next shift, because although I, talk about the Phillis Wheatley brand, and typically when people are talking about her, they are saying Phillis Wheatley, there has been a concerted effort to really think about her as Phillis Wheatley Peters, to think of her beyond the symbolism of Black women can be intellectuals and creative, and Black women can, do things that, dehumanizing stereotypes of eugenics or caricatures that were very prominent at the time of the height of the Wheatley brand. We've moved a little bit beyond that type of symbolism, and now we want to know who Phillis Wheatley is as a person. What did she write to her friend? What was her relationship with her husband? How was motherhood for her? Those are the questions that people are asking in this generation, in this era. And we have this statue that's at the Boston Women's Memorial on Commonwealth. Highly recommend that you visit if you haven't. I'll just put a quick plug in there for the Boston Women's Heritage Trail. But you have this very compelling statue that is not standing on a pedestal like many of the statues in the city, but is using it, and her words are a part of the memorial in a way that we don't typically see. And it invites us to think about Phyllis in a different way. And I think that, we'll be feasting on Phillis Wheatley's poetry and memorialization for many years to come. So with that, I will stop and open it up for any questions. I'm happy to go back and do a little bit of answer anything or read further from my book if people would like that. The last thing I'll say is that this image is one that I created, and there's a lot of other pictures within this one of her, the most famous kind of lithograph of a Black woman of that era, certainly. And all of these are pictures from the 1973 Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival. So thank you so much, and looking forward to our discussion.
Oh, well, thank you, Alexandria. That was wonderful. And I love what you ended on describing her statue, which I have seen in Boston. And I never thought about, but you're so right, the way that she's positioned, not standing on a pedestal, but seated, it does really sort of invite you in and draw you in and make you want to get to know her. So I think what a wonderful way to kind of end this presentation. So a reminder, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. I know I've seen a few come in here, and as I give folks time to get their questions in, I guess I'll start off with a question. I have a few here, but I guess a question that I have is, a lot of what you talked about in this presentation and in your book is the important role that community and that community memory has played in memorializing these women. And I'd love to know kind of what your thoughts are on the ways that community and public history organizations can work together today in memorialization efforts.
Yes, well, I mean, community is central.
Yeah.
There are times when memorials or namings happen without the quote unquote consent of the community. And they can be quite contentious, but typically memorials are reflecting people who live in a particular space and what they think is important. It's one of the reasons why we got so many of those Confederate statues during the same era that Phillis Wheatley's brand became prominent. Those were community-centric decisions, just not including everybody who lived in the community. And so I think that it's essential. One of the things that this research has taught me, the memorializers in this work have taught me, it's not just about what who the person was, I should say. It's more about what does that person mean to the people making the memorial? What does the community say about Phillis Wheatley and who she is and why she's important? That's actually the central aspect of how and why someone gets memorialized. Up here in the Berkshires, we did a street naming of Elizabeth Freeman Way a couple of years ago. And one of the things that I said to the community at the dedication was, us naming or you naming Elizabeth Freeman Way says way more about you than it does about Elizabeth Freeman. And so I think people should think about that and also understand that people's viewpoints change. What meant so much to newly freed, newly emancipated Black men and women in Washington, D.C. when they paid their money, their change in dollars to erect the Emancipation statue. It shifted, 50 years later, when it was, or, 100 years later when it was time to celebrate the centennial. And so while the memorials we have may reflect our community today, they don't always stay stagnant. And we have to be open to, I think, we should be open to evolving our thought about who gets memorialized and why, based on who we are as a
Yeah,
community.
great. I know we have some questions coming in too. Um, so let me start off here. So we have one question. Was the SS Phillis Wheatley promoted during the same time of the idea of African repatriation to Liberia?
Yes, yes.
Mm.
And that's an idea that actually began in the 19th century. So it wasn't a new idea, but this was Marcus Garvey's and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. This was their kind of a way of how to make that a reality. It was really about Black economic freedom. And Liberia was seen as one of those spaces where there could be kind of an upbuilding of a Black community without the oppression of and the realities of the Jim Crow era.
So we have another question here from Ann Moritz. My first introduction to Phillis Wheatley was a UMass Boston building that carries her name. I knew nothing about her and was left on my own to find out. I'm wondering what in your experience impressed you that has gone beyond her name to help folks learn the reasons for choosing her.
Ooh, that's a good question. No, I get a question. I'm gonna go off a little bit, but then I'll come back. I get a question often about, why name something for somebody if nobody knows who that person is? And I always say because you have the opportunity to learn. Had the building at UMass Boston not been named for Phillis Wheatley, would you have had the same type of engagement? It's the same thing that I say with movies. I know there's always a lot of controversy. The Harriet Tubman movie, there was controversy with that. The Madam C.J. Walker series on Netflix. But we were having conversations about Harriet Tubman and Madam C.J. Walker that we would not have had otherwise. So I really do think that there is efficacy in naming something, even if the memory lags or is lost from one generation to the next, because it gives you the opportunity to find more. And to Anne's question, I would say, I think for me it was the YWCAs. I mean, that was really it was the spark for me. I had that question and I just was able to find so much more. But also, one of the things that I found was that I was familiar with the Phillis Wheatley YWCA in ways that I didn't even realize. I was rereading one of Toni Morrison's book. I think it was Love, but don't quote me on that. And they talked about one of the characters living in the Phillis Wheatley home. And I was like, wow, this is really a part of just, things that I didn't even consider, which shows how embedded it is. So Toni Morrison, I never had the honor of meeting her. I'm sure she didn't really understand, the Phillis Wheatley brand and memorialization. She was writing about that as like a real reference to what people would have done. And that's how embedded these memorials are in our culture. So we can go to Albuquerque, New Mexico. We can go to California. We can go to the South. We can go to Seattle, and we can still find similar stories of people naming things. So that was the thing for me about seeing something with her and delving deeper. It opened up a whole new world, and it really was kind of a domino effect in how I conceptualized African American public history.
Well, speaking of the YWCAs, we have a question related to that. Was the affiliation of the Phillis Wheatley societies with the YWCAs based on literacy programs through the YWCAs or simply facility use by community organizations?
There were a wide span. There were a lot of organizations, including the YWCA, that delved deep into her poetry. Many also didn't do that. They just kind of employed her symbolism as meaningful to them and the work that they were doing. And so, yeah, there were poetry readings, oratorical contests, but there were a lot of other things. There was the drama club. The picture that I showed was from the Richmond, Virginia YWCA, and they had all kinds of really cool programs. They have these great scrapbooks at Virginia Commonwealth University, and you can just see the wide range of programs. They did a lot of things with young people, but they also did a lot of things with adults. They would give out scholarships. So some of it was about literacy and the literary legacy of Wheatley, but more often than not, it was all service oriented based on the needs of the community.
Um, what and when was the impetus for the Phillis Wheatley Boston Public School? Or sorry, for the Phillis Wheatley Boston Public School. Did she really study Greek? Did she, oops, sorry, I scrolled too fast. Did she encourage others to study it, to read the New Testament or serious philosophy?
I missed the first part of the
Oh,
question.
sorry, I can read that again. I scrolled away. What and when was the impetus for the Phillis Wheatley Boston Public School? Did she really study Greek? Did she encourage others to study it, to read the New Testament or serious philosophy?
I'm not familiar with the Boston Phillis Wheatley Public School, but I know that a lot of historians have done more research about her as a person and what her life was like based on the records that exist from the Wheatley family. There's a lot of records at the Massachusetts Historical Society that kind of delve into her life and her aptitude for learning. What I have gleaned from those scholars and some of my colleagues who I've done presentations with is that Phyllis had a high aptitude for learning before she was enslaved. And that is the foundation that allowed her to learn a myriad of languages. And so I can see people having knowledge of that and trying to model a public school after that same type of style to give young people the opportunity to learn multiple languages to express themselves. So some people have called Phyllis Wheatley a prodigy. I certainly think she was. I'm not a language person myself, so I know how difficult it can be. But for some people, they know two or three languages, they have an aptitude for it, and she was one of those people. And so I can see how a community would want to instill that in its young people.
All right, we have a few more questions here. Or someone has pointed out that the Phyllis Wheatley statue in the Boston Commonwealth Ave Memorial is positioned equally in a triangle with Abigail Adams and Lucy Stone.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's if you think about the landscape of memorials, I mean, just think for those of us who are local about the Boston Public Garden or the Boston Common. All of these statues are up on a pedestal. And you get a little variation on Commonwealth Avenue, but this was really intentional from the sculptor, Margaret Bergman, who wanted to have women be commemorated as being really active and not standing on a pedestal, but using it to make their communities better. And so all the women are kind of in non-traditional poses and they're not on their pedestal. I think Lucy Stone is kind of leaning over on hers, and Abigail Adams has her arms crossed with her back to her pedestal. And so they all are kind of in conversation and pushing us to think about, why these memorials, the traditional memorials before that, have been positioned in the way that they are. So I definitely would encourage people to go visit them and kind of see it for yourself. But it is a memorial that has layers of meaning.
All right. Another question we have is, how do you reconcile the memorialized person with the historic person? Do you, in a sense, see them as different people?
Sometimes, but not really. It's hard for us to talk about all aspects of a person. And, even as historians or biographers, it's hard to really get at the root to who people are. And so oftentimes they are memorialized for their good works or notable deeds. And those are the aspects of the person that people typically celebrate. In my own work, I didn't really do that today because I thought with our audience, we kind of had a foundation of who Phyllis Wheatley was. But I typically do a bio, just a short one. In the book, I have a short bio on every woman that I mentioned, memorializer and memorialized, so that people have a grounding, kind of a sense of who this person was and why would they kind of be worthy of being memorialized. but also what prompted the people, the memorializers, the public memory crafters to take up this particular commemoration cause. So I do a little bit of both, but I think it's hard to really memorialize all of a person, just like it's hard to write about the interiority, as Darlene Clark Hine says, of African American women.
Well, to finish up, we've had a couple of questions about how can folks stay in touch with you, kind of follow your research, stay connected to it. Are you going to be presenting at ASLH this fall or at other conferences? How can we kind of stay connected to your work?
Yes, I will put my website in the chat. I'll do that in a moment because it's hard for me to
Oh
multitask.
yeah.
But it's Dr. Alexandria Russell.com. DrAlexandria.com. And I have events there. I have links to Black Women Legacies. I have links to my other presentations that I've done. You can learn more about my nonprofit, Black Women Legacies. And so there's kind of a lot of information, and you can contact me on the contact page as well. And that email, that will come to my email directly. That's the best way to reach me. And so I would hope people can visit dralexandriarussell.com and find out more about my book tour. I will be at ASALA, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. I think that's what that is. There is another, the American Association for State and Local History, and I think that's in the fall as well. So I won't be at that one. But I will be in Atlanta at the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And I will be on a panel talking about Black women's memorialization, particularly as it pertains to Mary Church Terrell and, women of the Jim Crow era, celebrating Black history through name memorials. So yes, that's how to reach me. I will be there, and I always post public events. This event is on my website, and it is the culmination of my summer book tour. But I'll have some events in the fall.
Wonderful. I will also send a follow-up email to everyone, and I'll include the link to your website in
Oh,
there as well, so folks can access it that way. Wonderful. Oh, one last thing. People knit hats for the 3 women in the Women's Memorial during the winter. I think that's wonderful.
I know that. Oh,
Yeah.
I love that. Oh, that's wonderful.
Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight. Thank you so much to Dr. Alexandria Russell. This has just been a really fascinating presentation and has really helped me to think so much more about, I mean, we talk a lot about the power of naming, but I think you brought in a whole new perspective for me too. So thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you all of you who have come tonight.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good evening.